Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, our co-host, is here. Good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Real good. When we talk about Chicago, Chicago's been in the news. The biggest thing in the news is they're totally bankrupt, and maybe they can't pay their police or something. But what we want to talk about is the law and order in Chicago. But it looks like the feds are coming to the rescue. There's a strike force set up. Matter of fact, interesting enough, the strike force that's going to be much more involved in Chicago enforcing law was an idea of Obama. So we can argue this is bipartisan, and everybody wants us to be bipartisan. So this is a strike force. But of course, I find it a little bit threatening because they don't deal with why is there such a mess, and why is there so much crime there? Whose jurisdiction it is for this problem? And of course, the founders were pretty explicit that policing activity was not the role of a federal police force. So there's a lot of questions that are raised here, and the big thing is will the feds getting involved all of a sudden reduce the amount of crime there, or in a way, if you're very strict and inclusive in committing crimes, could they actually end up increasing the crime rate if you add all the infractions our governments get involved in, such as surveillance and taking guns from innocent people, those kind of things. So the real law enforcement problem just may well get worse, and I don't see the solution just by having a federal police activity and a strike force to march in to take over for the police department.
Yeah, and some might argue that, he's only sending in 20 additional ATF agents and say, well, it's not a big deal. Another 20, I think there's already 40 some there. But it's a new, as you point out, it's a new strike force, it's called. It sounds pretty scary. But it's sent in to deal with illegal guns, bringing guns into the city and this sort of thing. But, maybe 20 is not a big deal, but what if it opens the door to more? What about Homeland Security people? Who knows what?
Well, it's the principle of the thing. If you start with a little bit, we frequently refer to the income tax being very low, but look at what it morphed into, a monster. But I don't think this is brand new. I think this is going along with a sentiment, because we do have the Department of Homeland Security, and that's a police force. And, ATF now, I guess, has been around a long time. And there's a lot of federal laws. And it's not up to the police department of Chicago to enforce every federal law. And if I look at that and wonder where has the feds contributed the most, to this problem that Chicago has, well, we have to find out, what is the motivation. One, I think, is economics, and the federal government certainly has contributed to the economic mess. Of course, they believe they're solving it all the time because they believe in welfare redistribution, and they're all bankrupt, the states and the counties, and everybody's bankrupt, and the feds march in, so that hasn't worked. But the feds are the ones who have mandatory sentences for drug laws, and we have an administration now that's very hawkish on drug laws, and that's part of the problem as well, because if you have a weak economy and drugs are selling and people are just struggling, it's not a giant leap for some of these individuals to say, well, I'm going to go out and make a living, I'm going to sell drugs, and that contributes to it as well.
It's interesting you mentioned earlier that it's a bipartisan thing. I think it's even beyond that, because as we were preparing for the show, I looked into a wide variety of stories about it from New York Times, Fox News, and I read all of their representation of this event, and it was all actually pretty neutral, even mildly positive. There was no questioning whether it's a good idea. It was all, expand federal police, a good idea, essentially.
And that reminds me of how it becomes bipartisan when Trump decides to do some bombing here and there and expand wars. There's not a strong opposition. They want to go back to challenging the tweets and get into that, which in a way, if you're really into conspiracies, maybe they contrived this whole thing, because, the foreign policy marches on, and the Syrian war doesn't go away. At the same time, the Federal Reserve is not challenged. All these things, that's just, set aside, and people go along with it. But there's certainly a danger, I think, also an attack on guns. You know, in a free society where there's minimal federal police or no federal police on local laws, that most of the time safety and security comes from people being able to defend themselves. I used to and have on occasion mentioned that in Texas, you know, we still believe in the Second Amendment, and nobody goes into a house around the country and there are no policemen. and they understand that. And here, I don't know exactly what the laws are, but my suspicion is that the gun laws, not only the federal gun laws, but the local gun laws are pretty severe. So if you're struggling in that city, trying to live on a minimum wage, and your life is threatened, and you can't own a gun, you know, you might have to get tangled up in these gangs coming along and trying to rob you. But that is another thing. But I don't believe gun ownership is going to be enhanced by this strike force.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I think that's what it's targeting. You know, you mentioned earlier on the use of federal laws versus state laws, and I know Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, said they're relocating federal prosecutors and prioritizing prosecutions in Chicago. So their approach is more federal prosecutions. I think you had something about they prefer federal.
Yeah, that was their goal, but both the local people and the government preferred to do it because the laws are stricter and the penalties are much stricter, and they have to take everybody toward a federal grand jury. And the grand jury is a farce, although theoretically it sounds like, boy, this is great. Let the people, you know, sort this out and decide whether anybody should be charged and taken to trial. But they are actually a joke, and the joke, obviously, about grand juries is they could indict a ham sandwich. No matter what the prosecutors say, they have total control because the defendant can't say anything. They're not represented. So they hear one side of the story, and indictments today is you know, pretty tough because what it leads to is a deal is being made. If you plead for this crime, we're going to save you from 30 years, we're going to give you 5 years, and a lot of them confess up to crimes they don't have because I'm in duck soup and the defenders aren't even anxious to defend them. So it's a system, the judicial system contributes to this too and allows, you know, crime to get worse, and then we have these feds coming and they want to really expand it, and we saw that during the Hurricane Katrina, you know, how the feds came in back then. We didn't even have a strike force, but FEMA was the strike force, and they're there, and you know, and they have all the ability and the surveillance. I think this thing, they talk about how they're going to be able to use information about who has which bullets and which guns and this way. I think it's going to increase surveillance of a gun owner much more than ever before, and this might be a test run for super surveillance of anybody who owns a gun. And of course, they say we have a Second Amendment, but the gun ownership, there's registration out there. Of course, a lot of these crimes that we're talking about in Chicago probably, you know, aren't the registered ones. It's the ones the private individuals have. And then they say, well, we've heard of cases where the private individual, you know, is in the house, somebody comes in, he shoots them, he goes to jail, and the other one's left off on a technicality. And then you wonder why people get angry.
You know, we sort of were half joking with our title, Trump appointing himself police chief, but you know, I have another suggestion. Maybe our old friend Robert Wenzel should be appointed police chief of Chicago. Because, you know, a few years back, he put out a good piece on his Economic Policy Journal. It's a 4-part plan to fix Chicago. Maybe I'll throw it out and see what you think. First, the city halts all tax collection in the South Side. So the government has failed. They have no business trying to collect any more taxes there. Number 2, legalize all drugs on the South Side. He points out that most of the gang shootings are actually turf wars over drug sales. The third, eliminate all gun laws in the South Side. Anyone can carry any kind of gun they want. He said crime would drop immediately. And the fourth, eliminate the minimum wage. He says that the young kids are not able to find jobs. They have limited skills with a high minimum wage, and then they'll turn to crime. So that's Mayor Wenzel's 4-point plan for Chicago.
I'd vote for him over Obama's plan for this strike force that Donald Trump loves. But yeah, we've alluded to most of these, but not a whole lot on the tax. And I talked about the economy, but the minimum wage is pretty important because it causes more unemployment. And of course, the system causes the purchasing power to go down. And even the $15 minimum wage, that just causes more unemployment. And people do suffer under these circumstances of inflation because the low-income people suffer the most from inflation. But I find the issue of taxation just exempt people as they keep out the tax collectors. And I was always discouraged about what I read about after our Constitution was passed, that there was a tax rebellion back where I used to live, and I don't remember it, but you know, it was in 1794 under Washington. He wanted to enforce this law that Hamilton introduced, and that is tax the booze, tax the alcohol, and those Western Pennsylvanians didn't like that. Matter of fact, I found that an interesting thing there is they were cracking down because they needed the money. We were born in debt, and we needed the money to pay off this debt. So but the other thing is those Westerners didn't even trust the money. Anything east of the Appalachians, they didn't trust, so they didn't want to mess around with the continental money because it had been a horrible currency. They were using, booze. They were using whiskey as money, and it was doing pretty well, which serves the function, if you have something of real value, and they were able to do that. And you just wonder, nobody mentions it in history books. Well, what they were really wanting to do is to make sure they would live under the legal tender of the United States government, which is a tradition for all governments. You have to obey the legal tender laws. You have to listen to the government.
Well, maybe they should start using, I don't know about whiskey, but maybe something else as currency in Chicago.
Well, anyway, my biggest fear here, I don't know what your biggest fear is, but my biggest fear is that this is marching along to the militarization of the police force, and in combination, with the federal government. And that means that the stage is further being set for martial law. And we have generals in charge of the Department of Homeland Security. I expect that we're going to have more violence in the cities. I think this is just the beginning of what they're seeing in Chicago and Detroit. And if you look at the recent news, how many pension funds are totally bankrupt, and the states are bankrupt. And I think it was in Connecticut where the legislature passed a 35% increase in taxes, and this is just going to anger people or make their economy weaker. So I think we're going to have a lot more of this. And the stage is set. There's going to be no hesitation. There hasn't been. So the strike force is maybe just a different format, just a different element, but it's boosting it up a little bit. And I think we're going to see a lot of strike forces, and it won't be 35 people at a time. They're going to be sending in the Army. And they're not bashful. I mean, with that shooting that occurred, or the bombing that occurred in Boston, it essentially ended up in martial law. So the conditions are ripe for that. So I see that as the long-term detriment. I don't know if you've given any thought about what worries you about this trend.
Yeah, I think it reminds me of foreign policy. They're doing the same thing and thinking it'll work this time. And there was a quote from Sarah Huckabee. She's one of the White House spokespersons. And she essentially said, this crime problem is really a moral problem. It's a lack of morals. And therefore, we need more law enforcement to deal with this issue. But if they would just look at the Wenzel plan, yes, drugs are immoral. Taking drugs is immoral. We all agree with that. But changing the drug war might have a huge impact on even if you think it's immoral to take it, have a huge impact on crime.
Well, I think his 4 points sort of coincide with what we've been thinking about, but I'd still vote for him for chief of police if he wants to move to Chicago. Let's call him up and see if he'll go to Chicago and become the police chief. I'm afraid those liberals there would not welcome Wenzel as the police chief. But he could save some money because the police force would probably be a lot smaller. You do those kind of things and people might defend themselves and protect themselves, and they might have jobs. Yeah. That is the case. But I think it's a very important issue of law and order. I think it was very important what the founders did, and that is emphasize the fact that that the federal government was not to be the police force of each state. It was up to the states to enforce the law. But now we have so many federal laws, and there's a conflict. The Congress passes laws. We have a ton of federal laws. We have these drug laws. We have the tax laws. We have all these laws, and it's the obligation of the federal government, of the president, the executive branch, has to enforce the laws. Well, what if 90% of these laws are unconstitutional? I don't think we're at the point now where a president just said, forget it, I'm not going to introduce those. I mean, there would be, even a serious debate. Well, the president's obligation, he takes an oath of office that he will enforce the laws. So it's a very structural, it's philosophic, it's our attitude about the role of government, it's the attitude about how the Constitution should be interpreted and why it has gone astray from what the original intent was. But one thing for sure that would have to change to solve this problem is that the people would have to change their minds about what the role of government ought to be. And then for the few laws and regulations that we would have, you'd have to have men of character and determination and principle to enforce this system and not depend on somebody else coming in and abusing that. That, I think, is what happens. We had a constitution reasonably good, but men and women of character didn't go to Washington and emphasize this point. They went and emphasized the point that they take care of the special interests and completely distort the intent of the Constitution. So I think that right now we are at an impasse and what we're going to do. But I'm still sticking to my guns and saying people in this country need to wake up, realize what's happening, and decide that the role of government should be minimal. It should be minimal, and it should be for the protection of liberty and not to provide perfect security, perfect safety, and perfect welfare benefits. That all is dependent on the government using force and violence to redistribute wealth. It's never worked in history. It fails all the time, so let's quit doing it. Let's emphasize liberty for once. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.